Hello and welcome to the Commission for Victims and Survivors contribution to this year's digital Féile and Phobail. I'm Judith Thompson, Victims Commissioner, and I'm joined today by an expert panel. And in our conversation, we're going to look at how conflict enforces conformity to gender roles as well as to community, and how anything that deviates from the accepted narrative was suppressed. We explore how the roots of some of our equality challenges now lie in our conflict. And we ask, if diversity and equality are at the heart of peace, are we there yet? Or is this a baton we're passing on to the next generation? Hello, I'd like to thank the Féile and Phobail for inviting us to appear again this year. I think it's an incredible achievement that this whole festival has been put together online on short notice. And I guess as well, it shows the commitment of people to the festival and its importance, especially at this time. I'd like to welcome all our online viewers. And if you want to give us some feedback or join the conversation, then you can go to our Twitter account, which is Twitter @NIVictimsCon, or on our Facebook page. The things we're about to talk about, and in relation to conflict, the experience of conflict for men, women, and everybody, it's a shared one. We know a big chunk of the population was affected. We know that the issues we're going to talk about have resonance for a lot of those who'll be listening. If at the end of it you reflect, you feel you want to actually discuss things or seek some help, because resonance does raise feelings for people, then if you come to our website, and that's the Commission for Victims and Survivors Northern Ireland, we can signpost you to a whole range of help and support. So today, I'm Judith Thompson, Victims Commissioner, really delighted to be with you. With me, I have Leslie Veronica, who is a member of the Victims and Survivors Forum and also a lecturer at the Belfast Metropolitan College. I've Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre, Gavin Boyd from the Rainbow Project, and Catherine O'Rourke from the University of Ulster. And what we're going to look at today, in the broadest sense, is gender and how people are affected by conflict. So in many ways, the story of conflict, of the Troubles, is one that comes across as murder, mayhem, and men. But in reality, everybody's affected. And what we want to focus on today is, how did gender, in the widest sense, affect how people were influenced, were affected themselves by conflict? And how did they experience it, and how were they expected to respond? And that we want to look at for women and for men, and for people who, male or female, were lesbian, bisexual, transgender, homosexual, people who themselves, I think, had a very particular experience of the violence that was our conflict. We want to look at the less told stories. What was the impact of conflict, not just in communities, but behind doors and in families? What was the impact of violence on families and on women in the home? We live in a place where we still have a lot more people who legally, as well as some not legally, hold firearms, and during the Troubles that was very much the case. So how did that play into domestic violence and situations at home? And how did the conflict affect roles and expectations of women and of men? And how did the Troubles impact on the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transsexual men and women? And finally, and most importantly really, how far has peace changed that? If conflict is something which has affected adversely most of us one way or another in this society, how much has peace taken us back into a place where gender and roles are more flexible, inclusive and normal? I want to start with a question, Eileen, to yourself, as somebody who's been, for many decades now, working in communities that were experiencing violence, working through the peace process and across communities. What did you hope for women from the peace process here? And how far do you think, Eileen, that the Good Friday Agreement has actually delivered for women?
Well, to start with the Good Friday Agreement, at the time, the women's movement, the women's sector was working very, very hard behind the scenes 10 years before the Good Friday Agreement. And when the Good Friday Agreement was voted for, which I believe was down to hard work of the women's movement within communities that were working under the radar, probably made that successful for that vote. And within the Good Friday Agreement, there was a number of things, and I speak personally, a number of things that I liked about it, and a number of things I didn't like about it. But the majority of the things that I liked was about 80% of the Good Friday Agreement. So I voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement because of that. But the stuff that I voted for as a woman, and hoping that the hope would be there for peace in the future, many of those things haven't been delivered. And, I'm talking about the Civic Forum, which was suspended the first time that Stormont sort of way suspended itself. The Bill of Rights we still don't have. Dealing with the past, we're still dealing with issues within dealing with the past, and gender equality, which we still don't have in place. There's a number of things, that has happened since the Good Friday Agreement, even though that our communities voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement. We had the St Andrews Agreement, we had the Stormont House Agreement, that was all done behind closed doors and was agreed on without any vote of the people who originally voted for the Good Friday Agreement. So there's still a lot there that needs, and even some of the stuff that actually was achieved within the Good Friday Agreement. I mentioned the men getting out of prison. I mean, they're still dealing with issues. They can't travel. It goes against them, when they're going for jobs. They can't get into certain countries. So even though that part of the Good Friday Agreement was actually a part I didn't agree with, was releasing the political prisoners at that time, I would have preferred everything else to be put in place before they were released, and maybe we'd have more of the stuff that we haven't got within the Good Friday Agreement. So I'm a bit, 22 years on, 23 years on from the 22 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. I'm still fighting the issues that I have been fighting for the last 40 years, never mind the last 22 years. So the Good Friday Agreement really was a sense of hope. We don't have the same amount of bombs and people being murdered, and that's a good effect of it. But until people are treated equally, we're still going to have that conflict in some shape or form. It may not be violence on the street, but it's still a conflict, nevertheless. And a lot of that is women fighting for the rights, not just for women, but women fighting for their rights is a fight for the family. It's also a fight for men, because if we're all treated equally, we'll all have the same. And it's a bit like, if people are getting the grapes and the other people are not, we all want to be treated the same. In the 21st century, I think it's not that much to ask, because when the things that we're fighting for already are in existence in other parts of the United Kingdom. And I think the women's movement in particular, and the women's centres in particular, we have an all-Ireland approach with women and gender. And not only that, we also support other gender equality issues that's out there. And I don't want to go into them because Gavin's here, but the equality, the marriage equality was something that other people had, and just the right to choose, the Abortion Act, in this day and age, we have just secured that you'll not go to life in prison for helping somebody, so there's a lot of things there that we're still fighting for that really shouldn't be. And I touch on another one that's maybe 30 years old, which we actually thought we would get through the Good Friday Agreement was 1325, which is not recognised here in Northern Ireland. So there's still a mountain to climb.
Thank you, Anne. And I think we'll come back to that mountain to climb at the end. But from hearing your reflections as a woman who was so involved in the peace process and so involved still in the women's movement, I want to come on next to Leslie. I mean, I know, Leslie, that in our conversations you've raised some very similar issues. What do you think that the impact of conflict was on men and women, and I guess women in particular? And how far do you think we've moved in the peace process?
Well, I think, first of all, narratives of masculinity and femininity shape our whole interpretation of the conflict, and continue to influence the post-conflict terrain. I mean, it's always been my belief that those narratives that are heavily based on gender norms, and gender norms that favour men and give men more of a public role and all of that, really were tightly placed during the conflict. And we haven't really got away from that as much as we need to do. I suppose for me, that if you prioritise the story of what happened to men in the conflict, which is what has happened for the most part, then you run the risk of continuing to prioritise that in the post-conflict settlements. And in many respects, I agree completely with what Eileen said. There was a great opportunity at the time of the Good Friday Agreement to break through that. And it looked like we had, but yet since then, it's like we've gone back a ways with some of that stuff. So, I mean, if I think about my own personal experience in terms of, you know, my father's death, I mean, there's a couple of things around there that highlight what I think about this. So my father was killed, and this death focus that we have, for a start, that really focuses in and reinforces this view of the heroic male sacrifice. It misses the impact on the family. It misses the real impact, in a way, of what is the cost of a violent death like that, because the real cost was the next 10 to 15 years. It was the poverty, it was my mother being terribly depressed, and the impact that that had on us and the vulnerabilities that exposed us to. But it also does something more subtle. It sort of says, look, do you know what? The story of what happens to these women and children isn't important. Like, as a society, really the message is that's to one side. You know, you just get on with it. But it's very important. Commemoration is another way. I mean, I have heard about commemoration events, right? People haven't even always had the good manners to tell me they're happening, that involve my father. And they're also heavily gendered. I have real issues with the way we commemorate things here, because it's so gendered. And it's gendered in a way that maintains those gender norms. The idea of the soldier, the hero, the saviour of the nation, and women are completely out of that picture altogether. And that reinforces gender inequality. So all of this means, I think, that two things overall. First of all, that there are so many aspects of the conflict that are just not acknowledged. And if they're not acknowledged, then they're not being addressed. And these need to be acknowledged at a policy level. Some of these things are definitely acknowledged in really good academic research. And I know Catherine will speak to some of this later on, I'm sure. But a lot of it hasn't made its way from the academic research into a policy level, and that's where it needs to be if it's going to have an impact on the ground for real people's lives. So what am I talking about? Socioeconomic harms, and the way that has played out really right across the board. I mean, certainly in my own case, I know that we were catapulted into a situation of poverty, and yet I also know from meeting other women now and talking to them about how they were left, how their family was left after a bereavement, that we were the lucky ones, because my mother got a war widow's pension. Like, we were actually top of that pile. And yet my memory of childhood is growing up in poverty, being cold, having very few clothes, you know, feeling like the poor kid in school. That is one aspect. Vulnerabilities. These women were vulnerable, and they were not only vulnerable in their community, they were also heavily policed in their community, even after their bereavement in many cases. Like, that hasn't been explored. Of course, men were heavily policed in those communities too, and I acknowledge that. But I think from this point of view, for me now, I have sort of reached a point where I think we really need to be prepared to say we cannot tolerate this sort of invisibility, this massive gap in our knowledge. And it's a rich source. It's a rich source in terms of widening our understanding of what the conflict was like, but it's also very important for us to move forward, because as somebody who is primarily motivated through my membership and the reason, I suppose, that I'm involved with the forum, my motivation is to not see this happen again. And I think that really to prevent that, we need to get away from the glorification, the heroism, this idea that, you know, you're saving your community if you commit these crimes or if you're sacrificed. And we need to get in the nitty-gritty of, look, here's the reality. This is what this creates. This is the trauma. This is what actually happens if we go down this path. So I think there's a missed opportunity there too.
Leslie, thank you. And there's what's in there. You raised the kind of the phrase about women being policed within their community. And I know as a social worker working in Belfast in the 1980s, I saw that. And also the whole thing about gender conformity and conflict. I'd like to come to Gavin next and kind of pick up on these things about roles and gender and conformity, and ask you, Gavin, really to talk a bit about the experience of men and women who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual during the Troubles. And I guess, how much do you think that's changed in peacetime?
It's such an invisible part of the story that we tell about the conflict, was the experiences of LGBT people. And I think that's largely because, like, human beings are really, really complicated, messy people. We have all these intersecting parts of who we are, from our like class and race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation. But conflict is usually about telling a simple story of who we are. It's about telling stories of us and them. And I think for a lot of LGBT people, historically, we don't fit in to whoever is considered to be us. We're always going to be them. Even if that's, you know, you're an outsider within your own kind of traditional community that you're born into. And I think that how gender shapes our understanding of how men and women are supposed to act, LGBT people will always be seen as a distraction, as a deviancy away from the expected norms of how men and women are supposed to be. So in a conflict society, like, we see the role of men as being these kind of brutalized creatures who exist to defend and use strength and violence to protect their community or to advance their political cause. And the role of women is there to support the men and to raise the men's children, and oftentimes raise the next generation of combatants to perpetuate conflict. And I think how this impacted on LGBT people was just to make them invisible, either through the kind of violent suppression of difference, or oftentimes the knock on the door that people would have got that would tell them that we know who you are, and we expect you to be on the ferry out. And I think that's one of the problems that the LGBT community in Northern Ireland still has today, is that we're missing a generation of people that aren't here. We're missing a generation of people who went to London or Manchester or New York or Glasgow. And that's a real problem for our community, because unlike other populations, like, we tend not to be born of each other. So our parents aren't usually LGBT, our siblings aren't usually LGBT. We have to forge a community for ourselves and forge stories and narratives for ourselves. And for so many people, we didn't have elders. We didn't have a generation above us to teach us about their experiences. We have to piece it together from the shards that were left behind. And I think that we're still dealing with that today. We're still dealing with the fact that because so many LGBT people either left or lived completely invisible lives during the conflict, we have this sense that they don't exist, that they weren't a part of that story, but they were, oftentimes forging a different kind of community outside the either-or binary system that was created. So, I mean, Eileen could tell you about the bars and the parties that happened with people from the Falls and the Shankill, from east and west Belfast, from north and south. And even today, the sector, the LGBT sector, like, we can look at the conflict between politicians and think, why is it so difficult for you to work together when we're able to do it relatively easily? You know, in our sector, we have people who are, you know, who have family in the armed forces, who, you know, do fundraising for the Royal British Legion, and we have people who are, you know, the sons and daughters, brothers and sisters of combatants from paramilitary organizations? Why is it that we're able to move beyond these issues and deliver for the people that we work with whenever politicians seem so intransigent about moving on from the conflict that they still seem to perpetuate? And so I think that one of the biggest problems that we still see in terms of advancing LGBT equality in Northern Ireland is the invisibility of the population, like the lack of data held by statutory agencies on the experiences of LGBT people is criminal. We've had 22 years of a public sector statutory obligation to maintain data on LGBT people, but in the last programme for government, the Equality Impact Assessment, it was the sexual orientation was the only characteristic that government said that they had no data on. So if you're invisible to government, how can they possibly address your needs? If you're invisible to the policy development processes, then nothing is directed at reducing the inequalities that LGBT people experience, because we're a traumatized society across the board. Everyone is dealing with the intergenerational legacy of a conflict, and that's why Northern Ireland has incredibly poor mental health. But if you look at the mental health for LGBT people underneath that, it is worse again. And because the data isn't there, because the stories aren't told, then we still don't have the level of action that you would want to see to start to redress some of those inequalities.
Thank you, Gavin. And it's really interesting, isn't it? All of you've talked about, I mean, both you and Leslie particularly, about invisibility for women and for the LGBT community. And also, Gavin, you said something around the where we are now and the distance we have to go. And I think those are really important common points. And also it's interesting that you talk about how the LGBT community quietly got on across those peace lines. And you reference, and I know I've heard Eileen talk about how women quietly and sometimes not quietly got on with business together across those peace lines. And those are really important themes, I think, that are coming forward here. Catherine, I'd like to kind of move forward to you as as a researcher and somebody who's worked a lot around this area. What does the research you've done tell us about these themes, and are we similar to or different from other conflict zones?
Thank you, Judith, for the invitation, the opportunity to contribute. I wanted to speak a little bit about research that's been done by myself and colleagues at the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University that speak really directly to these themes, and I think give us a very valuable evidence base for the sorts of issues that have come out already. You started yourself, I think, by talking about the question of domestic violence in the North and the ways in which that interacted with the conflict and its legacy. And Monica McWilliams did really the world's first empirical study that looked at the relationship between conflict and individual experiences of domestic violence. And what she found when she conducted the original study in 1992 was that the use of firearms in domestic violence was much more common here in the North than it was in the South or in elsewhere in the UK. And that was, I think, reasonably was attributed to the significantly increased availability of legal and illegal firearms. She also found, when speaking to women who were victims and to women who worked in domestic violence, that there were a lot of barriers that existed to accessing, particularly the police, in terms of being able to exit domestic violence because of the conflict. So either there was community alienation from the police. There was also the police often felt additional insecurity in accessing certain communities. So there are stories of the police sending helicopters to domestic violence situations in South Armagh. Concerns that these situations are being contrived to lure police. So the whole security situation in the public space impacted very directly on the private space. And also, frankly, in the police response. So there was a sense in which the police were prioritising the paramilitary and political violence over private incidences of violence. And so those were all very important findings that Monica McWilliams made in 1992 in what was really a globally significant study, the first one of its kind. She was able to replicate that study with Jessica Doyle in 2017. So she used exactly the same methodology, spoke to a similar number of survivors and people working in the sector. And what she found actually was broadly very positive. She found that particularly in terms of the quality of the police response and perceptions of police response, there was a massive improvement. So that issue of sort of community alienation from police had really, in important ways, had gone away, and there was much more confidence and capacity in the police due to the end of the conflict and police reforms. What she did, however, find was that there was a residual paramilitary influence on so individual women who were threatened by paramilitary connections, if the perpetrator was connected to paramilitaries, or indeed if the perpetrator just claimed to be connected to paramilitary. So there was this kind of residual paramilitary influence on domestic violence even now, several years post-conflict. Those findings, those kind of broadly positive findings from Monica's study, they contrasted with other work that was done by my colleague Fidelma Ash. She looked more directly at the experiences of the LGBT community and their experiences of the transition in a project she called LGBT Visions of Peace. And actually what she found, contrary to the domestic violence work, what she found was actually a very consistent story of continuing insecurity, even in the post-conflict setting. And much of this was determined by, again, a sort of ongoing challenges around the relationship with the police, ongoing kind of stigmatization and security concerns connected to being outed, and actually quite an important role for the religious communities in maintaining the sorts of attitudes that supported that insecurity. And then finally, just to speak to some work by Brandon Hamber. So he conducted, I think, a very important piece of work where he spoke to, looking specifically at masculinities in the North, in Northern Ireland post-conflict. He conducted research with several young men and youth workers in 9 of the most deprived areas across Northern Ireland. And what he was interested in was sort of the potential membership of paramilitary organizations and why young men still might join paramilitary organizations. And he adopted a masculinities analysis really to look at sort of what were the hierarchies amongst young men in those settings. And more than anything, he found a lot of insecurity. So there were a lot of young men who were feeling very insecure due to poor mental health and poverty. And that those were really important factors in deciding their paths kind of in and out of paramilitary organizations, and also the fact that many of them were very afraid of being recruited to paramilitary organizations. And that sort of evidence-based in terms of bringing out the differences amongst men and hierarchies amongst men, I think also just reveals that importance of a gender analysis more broadly. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much for picking up so specifically on the themes that we were discussing here. And it's really interesting to see, isn't it, how the research reinforces, in some cases, a lot of what we've been hearing from people's experiences, but also going by the 2 pieces of research that you referenced there, that maybe for the LGBT community, things haven't moved just as far as they have for women. But let's go back. I want to give each of our panelists here a chance to kind of make final comment and what I'd like people to address in whatever way you wish. And I'm going to go to Gavin first, I think, because Gavin, I think that difference between LGBT community and possibly other people in terms of peace is a striking one. Where are we now? And are the strengths that have been hard won through tackling adversity that maybe we need to capitalise on going forward if we want to get to be the sort of inclusive society we aim for?
Sure. I mean, Eileen touched on it when she talked about like the unfulfilled promise of the Good Friday Agreement. Because the Good Friday Agreement should have been a complete new start. It should have been like a constitutional founding document for what Northern Ireland could have been. And right in there is the Section 75 equality duties, and including sexual orientation and gender in there is really important. And at the time it was world leading, and it should have been a great opportunity to make Northern Ireland an incredibly LGBT inclusive place. But the problem was that didn't actually happen. That wasn't bedded down. And certainly like the loss of the Civic Forum was a big part of diminishing the number of voices that were heard. And that's why it's unfortunate that, 22 years after a constitution for Northern Ireland said that it's an obligation to promote equality of opportunity for LGBT people. Every single step towards LGBT equality along the way has been a fight. We have always lagged behind the other jurisdictions of the UK. We've lagged behind progress in the South and across the rest of Europe as well. And that's because the humanity of LGBT people is still somehow contested and still somehow debatable. And that's tiring for our community. It leads to a lot of young people feeling a real strong push to leave Northern Ireland. And with them goes their skills and talents and everything that we then miss when they're not here. But I think that there is a silver lining, a positive that comes out of the fact that we have had to fight and struggle for every measure of equality, and that's that we haven't become complacent as a community. I see it in other jurisdictions where achieving legislative equality has been relatively easy compared to Northern Ireland, that the organisations or the community networks that were there to force change didn't necessarily maintain after they achieved the kind of legal equality that we've seen. So I think Northern Ireland's benefit is that we are always mindful of the risks to our community, and that forces us to be creative and keep progress moving forward.
Thank you, Gavin. That's really helpful. Eileen, can I go to you next? I know when we talked before, you talked about the fight that is still in it. Can I ask you just to talk for a moment on where you see things for women now and how you want to see it moving forward?
Unfortunately, probably mine's mostly what we still haven't got and how everything that we haven't got, and Gavin mentioned that Section 75, everything that we're fighting for is actually in Section 75, but it's not being executed. And if Section 75 were being, brought to the fore, it would mean we would get a lot of stuff. There's a number of things that has started to happen which affects women's organisations and the women's movement in general, is that they have brought in tendering processes which discriminate against the smaller organisations. And that's not just within women, but we had a process there of tendering. We tendering for the Fresh Start. Even the women's programme within the Fresh Start was tendered for. I assumed and thought that the 14 women's centres that actually fought for 10 years before the Good Friday Agreement would get a bit of that. They didn't. It was a tendered. Politics Plus was another one that was a tender process. And all these organisations came to the like of me to recruit the women for these programmes. And I know that's happening through the Piece 4, Piece 5 tendering process now, which discriminates mainly against women and people of different sexual connotations. So we need to be sort of looking to see what's being done fairly. When they give these tendering processes, I feel that when we're actually wanting to move forward at all levels, and in particular grassroots, because grassroots don't have a seat at the table, we need to have people round the table who are actually hands-on with the issues at grassroots. Then we need the next stage of women round that table too, and it's not anti-men. I need to get that across. We want men round the table.
Because I think what I'm hearing there so clearly is the fight is still going on, and this is not a done deal yet, and there is a lot still to achieve of what was envisaged. Leslie, have you a final thought for us in terms of where we are now?
Yeah. I think I have, if we can get our legacy institutions up and running, that might be a good start. I mean, my hope was that two aspects in particular, the oral history archive, I thought would give us an opportunity to start to get some of those voices heard and recorded in a way that hasn't happened before. And the other thing is the IRG. And I think the IRG would have the potential to be a very powerful group if it was properly executed, or indeed executed at all. Because I think that what it can do is break through our tendency to, particularly, as I said, a governmental level, to treat the conflict at an event sort of based analysis, and to look more at structural causes. And it's only when you get to the structural that people can start to see the patterns and can start to see why what impacts one group does have an influence, as Eileen says, on all the other groups. So I think for me, I had great faith in those institutions, and I would really like to see that move forward, and although at the minute it looks a bit tentative. I do think that another sort of, if we're thinking about positives, I mean, I teach young people and they are mostly between 16 and 20, and they do have a different outlook, and I do think we can't leave all hard work up to them. And there's still, you know, people can be very keen to see a different way of going, but it's how do you get that to government level? That, you know, it can be tricky, but they do have a different outlook, and I do have a lot of faith that this generation coming through is going to be suitably disgusted enough to demand some of these changes and to keep pushing and to pick up that baton from older generations such as myself to keep pushing for it.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's the pattern you see passing. Catherine, final thought for you. We've talked about themes and patterns, and obviously as a researcher, that's what you look at primarily. But do you have any thoughts about kind of next steps or things that we really need to tackle to move this forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the uneven gendered outcomes of our peace process, you know, Northern Ireland's certainly not unique. I mean, I think we've seen that across the world. There is a tendency for, well, first of all, there's often a tendency for violence to recur at quite a wide scale. And, you know, Northern Ireland's very successful in global terms on that measure, you know, in the sense that we haven't had a recourse back to widespread political violence. But where we have been poor is on the issues that we've talked about today, which is on the sort of the more transformative human rights and equality agenda, and delivering on the promise of the peace agreement. And it does seem to me that until we have a process to deal with the past more comprehensively, as Leslie pointed to, then all of those issues instead get dealt with everything else. So they get sort of telescoped into discussions around an LGBT strategy, around funding community organisations, and we have these kind of proxy battles instead in those issues. So we can't move on on those issues either. So it seems to me that it is time that we start, I suppose, holding, as I know we're all trying to do, but start holding our policymakers to account on the agreements and the commitments that they have made, if we really do want to move forward, because those are the agreements and commitments where there was at one point at least political consensus and commitment.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think that's about all we have time to right now. But I think we've heard very powerfully from all of our panelists, and I'd like to thank you all so much for giving us your time today. I think we've heard from all of you how conflict leads to conformity, and that conformity actually constrains and causes harm to women, to men, to the LGBT community, and I guess to anybody who's seen not to conform. So if peace then is about diversity, and if our road to peace, our continuing road to peace, is a road we're still travelling. And as Catherine said at the end there, you know, we need to stop fighting proxy battles. And we need to genuinely address the issues about having, you know, a more inclusive, a more genuinely inclusive and equal society. And that, I guess, is one of the clearest benefits and indicators of peace that we're still fighting to attain. And I think we should all recognise the fight that is still in it, the fight that people have given themselves to over decades in the case of some of our panellists, and the next generation coming along to pick up that battle. And how do we help them do it? Thank you all.